I'm absolutely delighted to be here with you today to talk about a topic that is really very, very close to my heart, patient engagement in medicine's development. I will take you through with a little bit of a retrospective where we are today and some of my thoughts and ideas on where we might be 2030 and beyond. So by way of introduction, it's clear that patients' participation in health has grown enormously in Europe over the last 2 decades. And the level of that engagement may vary in different contexts, but it's clear that concepts like patient engagement, partnership, co-design are the new paradigm. Increasingly, both industry and healthcare systems alike see patient engagement as a strategic imperative to de-risk R&D, to move towards person-centred, patient-centred, outcome-based and sustainable care. And this has been made possible mainly through the work and experience of patient organisations that have over the years really reshaped the concept of advocacy, right back from the wonderful, really inspiring work of the HIV movement in the late 80s and early 90s. We're really standing on the shoulder of giants here. But more impetus is now needed in ensuring implementation. Implementation is the key word, and this requires, of course, a cultural shift, robust tools and evidence, and crucially trust building to really make systematic, structured patient engagement a reality by 2030. In my presentation, I'd like to quickly look at patient engagement in the entire life cycle of medicines and the opportunities for this to happen at every juncture of that life cycle. I'd like to talk briefly about really flagship projects that have helped to shape patient engagement and the resources and tools that they produce that are really useful across all of the stakeholders. Home in on patient engagement in the regulatory environment because it is so critical and the leadership that EMA has shown. A few lessons from COVID that is also impacting on patient engagement, and a few concluding thoughts where I believe patient engagement might be in 2030 and beyond. So let's look first of all at patient advocates who are involved, who are intrinsically involved with a stake in patient engagement. What matters most to them? At collective level, through representative patient organisations and online communities, they want meaningful, and I stress meaningful, patient involvement in health services, health systems design and innovation that will ultimately influence their access to care, their experience of care, and the outcomes that really matter not only to them but to their peers and future generations. They want recognition of patients' unique experiential knowledge and expertise. They want to be valued as equal partners with a legitimate and important contribution, and they also want to be appropriately and fairly resourced to play this crucial role. Many of you will be perhaps familiar with this slide. It's a really crucial slide because it demonstrates, as I said, the many different ways that patients can be involved in the life cycle of medicine. This linear diagram almost actually demonstrates the different points from research prioritisation, really looking at the unmet need, research design, protocol design, providing patient information, all of the issues around informed consent. When it comes to research conduct and operations, trial steering committee involvement, being part of investigator meetings, looking at data and safety monitoring, and then further down the line, being part of the regulatory process, part of the HDA process, moving towards pharmacovigilance, being part of the whole agenda of real-world data to real-world evidence collection, and so on and so forth. There are very many junctures where patients can really play a very important role. Their role is actually multifaceted, also in the policy space. Thinking back to some of my experience in Brussels, if I think back to some of the medicines development legislation, the clinical trials regulation, for instance, EPF, my organisation, and many other patient organisations fought really hard in the European Parliament to make sure that the legislation had transparency embedded throughout, transparency in clinical trials even when they go wrong, to make sure that within the legislation it was absolutely clear that informed consent should be exactly that, informed consent. We were less successful when it came to patient involvement in ethics committees, but there has been some progress since then, particularly actually here in Netherlands and in Germany. We see the shift in clinical research and patients moving from being research subjects right through to being co-researchers or even driving forces, and I think Eurodis is a very good example of that. It's still a bit patchy when it comes to HTA and the involvement of patient involvement systematically in the HTA community. There's a really interesting project happening right now involving UPATSI, HTA International and EPF. It's really exploring once again the status and the temperature in the room when it comes to patient involvement in HTA. So it is moving, but probably more slowly than we would like it. However, the new legislation at European level, again, will provide a different sort of backdrop for more patient involvement in a European context as more joint collaboration happens in practice. The regulatory space, again, I'll talk about the European Medicines Agency in a little while, but there is much more systematic patient engagement in that space, and it's more and more becoming expected that will happen. It's not a choice, it's not a risk of involving patients, it's a risk of not involving patients increasingly. And then I think the patient's voice has also played an important role in actually addressing some of the public's scepticism and, quite frankly, fear about research and innovation. The dynamism of the patients' movement has been able to demonstrate very clearly why this matters, why this is the way forward. I'd like to home in now on a couple of really key projects that some of you may or may not know. At global level, the Patient-Focused Medicines Development Initiative was kicked off back in 2015, and it's really grown to become a very influential platform that is actually driving patient engagement not only in Europe and the US, but actually in many other regions of the world, and doing some fantastic stuff in Asia. It's a non-profit partnership based on expertise and commitment to better and meaningful patient engagement through the co-creation of tools and resources that are relevant to everybody with a stake in this space. The European Patient Academy on Therapeutic Innovation is focusing not directly on engagement, but on education, on delivering quality education to patients on the A to Z of medicine so that they can play their unique and critical role in the product life cycle. And UPATI is now 10 years old. We celebrated its 10th anniversary a couple of weeks ago in Brussels. It started out as an IMI project, a public-private partnership, and it's seen very proudly by the IMI because it's one of the few projects that has actually been sustainable. It has now become a foundation based here in the Netherlands to really move forward and continue to play its critical role. Just as an indicator of its impact and its success, the Toolbox, the multilingual Toolbox that is part of the suite of products that UPATI actually offers, has been downloaded by 5 million users. And this is just, I think, the start. I think now that the foundation is established and now that it's structured and has its own legal status, it will continue to go from strength to strength. Another important project, which was time limited but nonetheless extremely impactful, is Paradigm, another IMI project really looking at creating a sustainable framework, the right sort of structured processes and tools for patient engagement to happen. When we worked on Paradigm, we decided to home in on 3 specific junctures in the life cycle: research priority setting, design of clinical trials, and early dialogue between regulators, HTA bodies, and industry. With research and priority setting, it was clear that the patient's perspective was largely untapped at this point, yet input on unmet medical needs by patients is critical for prioritisation. The patient's perspective is also really vital when it comes to determination of value proposition. Design of clinical trials, again, a basic building block that needs routine patient involvement. But we recognise the voice of vulnerable and unaffiliated patients had not yet been integrated. So we work with children and young patients and networks that were working with these communities, and also older patients and patients living with dementia through organisations like Alzheimer Europe, to really unpack how they could bring a really authentic and genuine contribution to clinical trial design, and we've produced guidance and standard processes with that in mind. And finally, early dialogue with regulators and HTA bodies. Again, the patient's perspective was very often put to one side here, but yet the patient's voice, the patient's perspective is critical to inform access decisions. And through the work we did with regulators, with HTA bodies in Paradigm, we've come to a very, very clear modus vivendi to ensure that we are clear about the evidence requirements further down the line. This is a glimpse at the I'm so sorry. Thank you, sorry. Getting carried away. This is an overview of the Paradigm Toolbox, and I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but it just gives you an illustration of the wide range of tools that are available to support people who are serious about putting patient engagement into practice. There's guidance in relation to managing competing interests in a multi-stakeholder environment. There's guidance about patient engagement agreements. There's some important materials that look at how to set up a community advisory board. And one of my favourites, actually, because I think this is one of the key assets that came out of Paradigm and a really important legacy, is the patient engagement monitoring and evaluation framework, because it provides the metrics, provides the clarity on that return on engagement, which everybody needs to be able to move forward. You'll be able to download any of those tools on the PATI website, on the PFMD website, or the EPF website, and that demonstrates the sort of collaboration that's happening in that space. Another important legacy of Paradigm is the Patient Engagement Open Forum. Pre-COVID, it was conceived as part of the project as a face-to-face meeting on an annual basis, but it evolved into an ongoing engagement and dialogue with different stakeholders really coming together in a very honest and open way to roll up their sleeves and look at where the conundrums exist with regard to patient engagement, to come to the meeting with key challenges, key problems, and to solve those together, albeit online. And I believe that the open forum will continue to evolve in time and provide the kind of practical solutions to encourage more engagement across more stakeholders ultimately. Voilà. Thank you. Sorry, it's slightly confusing here. Thank you. Moving now to the European Medicines Agency, and as I said, they've provided enormous leadership when it comes to involving patients in a meaningful way. And this timeline demonstrates how this has evolved over many years. Initially dialogue with HIV patients, then moving to a framework for interaction with patients and consumers, the creation of the Patient and Consumer Working Party, the dedicated department set up in 2014, and now we're moving towards systematic inclusion of real-life experience in all EMA regulatory output. Why is this important? What is the added value? Engagement with patients brings the everyday aspects of living with a disease into scientific discussions and helps really bridge that gap between clinical trial data and real-world data. It improves transparency and trust. It increases understanding and dissemination of EMA outcomes, and it adds generally to the quality of the regulatory discourse. All perspectives are crucial and have ultimately resulted in more meaningful decisions for all concerned. Changing gear a little bit, I just wanted to dwell for a couple of minutes on some lessons from the COVID-19 pandemic. Clearly, we all know about the acceleration of digital health transformation, but the patient engagement piece in that process has been really critical as well. And as we've evolved, more and more digital tools are actually enhancing patient engagement across the life cycle as well. There's been an enhanced understanding and acceptance of the value of responsible health data sharing in a way that's never happened before. All of us were glued to the news, were reading newspapers, etc. All of the dashboards collecting the data in terms of how we manage COVID, how we move forward. And that, I think, has resulted in a different mood in terms of the public's acceptance of responsible data sharing. There's been more regulatory flexibility with quality remote clinical trials, which will indeed continue. We've seen the impact of new and agile partnerships. Obviously, the vaccine story is a very clear indication of how things can happen in a different way, with the right sort of will, with the right sort of enthusiasm. Another piece that's come out clearly is the importance of diversity, equity and inclusion, also vital in the patient engagement space. We know that underserved communities were disproportionately and vastly affected by COVID, and that's led to new thinking and different sorts of reflection on how we can actually include these communities in moving forward on patient engagement, not only in the life cycle of medicines, but also in the context of health services and health systems. Moving back to paradigm and looking forward, what are some of the prerequisites for patient engagement? Essentially, we're looking at three core buckets: culture, processes, and resources. When it comes to culture, we're looking at transparency, openness, communication, trust building. We're looking at every stakeholder getting something out of the experience, a win-win situation. And we're looking at solid and inclusive governance. When it comes to processes, we're looking at organisational flexibility and readiness. We're looking at complementarity, not duplication of existing resources, and an agility, an ability to evolve and adapt to changing needs. When it comes to resources, we're looking at a legal framework, governmental support, regulatory support, and political will. We're looking at being able to demonstrate the value, development of metrics, as I said earlier, and key performance indicators. We're looking at independence, we're looking at avoiding conflict of interest, and we're also looking at compensating participants appropriately. So I'm seeing Philip getting a little concerned here, so I'm moving to the last part of the presentation, which is really looking forward, 2030 and beyond. And this is very much a personal view. It's not an official EPF perspective by any means. Just a few thoughts from my side. I think when we're thinking to 2030 and beyond, we also need to look at the wider 2030 agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals. Goal 3 on health, the aspiration towards universal health coverage. This is also part of the patient engagement agenda, because patient advocacy groups across the globe are fighting really hard for that. And the more movement that is happening there, I think the easier patient engagement across the life cycle will also be. We need to look seriously at what's happening at global level. There is an increase of patient engagement in other regions of the world, but also recognition at global level with WHO, for instance, as well. We need to think about low and middle income countries, just looking and observing what's happening with the African Medicines Agency and how they're really learning and thinking through the experience of the European Medicines Agency when it comes to regulatory affairs and patient involvement. I believe personally that patient engagement will also move towards patient and public involvement. This happens already in the UK, in Ireland, in a couple of other countries, but in many countries it's not happening in the least. And I think there will be a move and tendency towards that also as we shift towards personalised prevention. There'll be a stronger link between patient engagement in medicine's life cycle and health systems design, and a move towards person-centred, value-based healthcare, based on the needs and goals expressed by patients themselves. And there will be a significant growth of patient engagement beyond medicines, in digital health, in artificial intelligence, in the medtech world. And this is a huge educational and awareness challenge and makes the role of the new Innovative Health Initiative really, really important. The successor of the Innovative Medicines Initiative, going beyond innovation in medicines to innovation in medtech, technological innovation, but also social and systems innovation. And initiatives like PFMD and UPATI are already thinking about that and working on this topic to look at how to embed engagement in these spaces, but also how to provide the right sort of education and support for patients to become involved. There will be, in 2030, unequivocal evidence that patient engagement de-risks medicine's development and leads to better outcomes and societal impact, because the metrics are there, because the evaluation and learning and monitoring is happening now on an ongoing, systematic basis. It's difficult to multitask, I'm proving everybody wrong. There will be an explicit link between patient engagement and environmental, societal and governance practices that a lot of companies are focusing very much on now, influencing investors' choices. I believe that patient engagement will be intrinsically linked to that moving forward. There will be a bigger patient voice and agency in defining unmet medical need and value from their perspective. There will be a modernisation of HTA. The question is whether patient involvement will become mandatory moving forward. Patient experience data and patient engagement evidence will become a prerequisite for regulators in terms of drug approval, and this will be very much under the leadership of both the European Medicines Agency and the FDA. There will be the impact of the European health data space and electronic health records, accessible, patient-oriented electronic health records will become universal. Interoperability will no longer be the problem it's been in the past, both in terms of local service provider to service provider or cross-country. And this will provide a completely new landscape for patient engagement, particularly in the context of real-world data, real-world evidence to capture the outcomes that really matter to them. And finally, there will be an increasing pool of highly diverse patient experts to advance patient engagement to ensure that medicines are actually as inclusive and as outcome-oriented as they possibly can be in the future. So with that in mind, I'd like to give the floor back to Philip to perhaps field any questions or comments you might have. Thank you very much for your attention, and I do apologise for the confusion with the slides earlier. It's a slight technical challenge here. Thank you very much.
I'm just wondering, Nicola, what are your views on what's needed to get that patient involvement in HTA? What are the next steps to come in the upcoming years to get to that point in 2030?
There are a number of things that need to happen. I think with some of the international societies that are moving more and more to patient engagement, the pressure that can be applied in that space will be apparent. I think organisations like HTA International and ISPOR can really lead by example. I think also we need to look at countries and agencies that are really doing the right thing and doing it right. Some of my work has actually, recent work has demonstrated that there's a new esprit, I think, for patient involvement and patient engagement in some of these countries. So I guess it's a series of different things that will hopefully move the agenda in the right direction. It's not easy, it's highly complex, there's still a question of trust, but I think it will happen in good time.
I have a question around patient engagement in care modeling, shaping patient care and moving towards more integrated care. I'm sure you have experience and know some patient groups that were successful in shaping that care. What do you see as key success factors that those groups leveraged on so that they were actually had an impact on that? So how do groups get to have impact in shaping patient care?
And EPF held its first major congress back in 2019 specifically on patient involvement in health systems and health services design. One of the key factors there was actually looking at patient involvement in not just in healthcare professional training and development, but looking at patient involvement in health managers training and development, not just at the beginning, but continuous professional development so that they can really understand and see and recognise why and where the patients can be involved. That was a really important factor coming out of that. I think the movement towards integrated care, I think also depends, an anchor for that is actually patient empowerment, and that's being increasingly recognised as well. Different components of patient empowerment, health literacy, shared decision making, self-management, and I think that is something that is also the champions of integrated care understand they need the patient's voice, so that's having a trickle-down effect as well. And there's new conversations that I'm experiencing now on essentially linking people, person-centred care and value-based care, instead of them going in parallel lines, actually looking at a much more integrated approach at macro, meso, and micro level. And I think, again, this will move things in the right direction.
Yeah. How can we make patient engagement more inclusive? So to make sure that we not only include the well-educated, informed patient representatives, advocates, and single families and patients, but also reach out to normally marginalized populations, not only from a regional point of view, but also from an educational point of view. I think it's really needed to have a broad picture.
Different stakeholders need to get serious about their diversity, equity and inclusion policies. I think it is also part of the ESG agenda, the equity, the environmental, social and governance piece. I think patient organisations are doing a lot to try and become more inclusive themselves. I know that EPF prepared a roadmap working with, for example, the European organisation representing homeless people, the organisation representing undocumented migrants, and did some really serious work and serious thinking about how to involve those people within those organisations. So I think it needs to come from the organisational side, the patient's movement itself, but it also needs to be embedded into the way that people are thinking. And it's not just about it being a nice thing or good thing to do, it's actually a strategic imperative. It's the right thing to do because that will lead to better medicines for more people, more populations ultimately.
Thank you very much.